I assume you have enrolled in this course because you have received intensified pressure from fellow board members, line managers, external bodies, and so on, to start embracing principles of good governance in your organization. You may even now feel ready to do just that. Either way, one thing is certain. Embracing and then implementing these principles does not seem to be an easy exercise. Put differently, compliance to principles such as board diversity, term limits for board members, conflict of interest procedures, gender equality policy, financial controls, to name just a few, does not really happen in many sport organizations. The question then becomes, why is this the case? Unless we understand the logics behind the behavior of non-compliance, it becomes harder to come up with solutions, to think of mechanisms that will help us comply with universal standards of good governance, with good governance principles that share a consensus within the wider sport ecosystem. My goal in this session is to explain to you all why sport organizations do not often implement principles of good governance. Through a 2x4 model, you should be able to discern the real challenges associated with good governance standards implementation. Let's start. Now, there are two sources, two reasons of non-compliance: the voluntary and the involuntary one. In other words, there are those who choose not to comply, that is, they are unwilling to comply, and those who want to comply but cannot, that is, they are unable to comply. Each of these two categories incorporates two logics. The voluntary non-compliance involves the logic of consequences and appropriateness, while involuntary non-compliance involves the logics of limited resources and rule ambiguity. Within the first category, the logic of consequences concerns the decision of the members of the organization to ignore, to disregard any guidelines, any recipes for implementing good governance principles. Let me give you an example. Let's assume that there is an article in a code of good governance stating that there is a maximum length of time a member can serve on the board, and adhering to that article will result in that member being off the board. So the member chooses not to comply because the consequence does not favor this person. The second logic of voluntary non-compliance is the logic of appropriateness. Here, some members may refuse to implement certain good governance measures because they do not consider these measures appropriate for their organization. After all, these organizations are surrounded by a governance culture in which practices associated with poor governance have been seen as the normal way of conducting their functions, activities, and procedures. Allow me to give you an example so you better understand this logic. Compliance with the article of the Code of Good Governance which refers to the maximum length of time a member can serve on the board of a national federation will lead to that member off the board. However, the specific member holds an important position on the board of the international federation of that sport, where through this position, this board member promotes, ethically and transparently, the respective interests of the national federation back in his or her country. By choosing to comply with the article of the code, the country represented by that member at the international level is deprived of the opportunity to benefit from his or her presence there. It is therefore judged that compliance with the rule is inappropriate for the purposes of both the organization and the country, and therefore non-compliance is chosen. Regarding those who are involuntarily non-compliant, what may be happening is that the intention to comply is there, but the ability to comply is absent. In other words, good governance must be adapted to a specific organizational context, considering factors such as the number and nature of tasks performed. Some sport organizations lack the special expertise that is required for the implementation of certain good governance principles. In other cases, financial or technical resources are required that these organizations may not possess. An example would help here to understand the logic of limited resources better. An article of the Code of Good Governance explicitly requires, even for the smallest in size federations, a 4-year strategic plan. These organizations, however, are staffed by 1 or 2 people and have little secretarial support. At the same time, board members devote most of their volunteer time to the organization's day-to-day operations. In fact, many of them do not have the knowledge to design a multi-year plan for the organization's future course. So while they consider this article of having a strategic plan together very important, they cannot comply with it. As far as the second logic of involuntary non-compliance is concerned, standards, articles, and rules of good governance are subject to subjective interpretations, as they are often formulated in an unclear and ambiguous manner, so as to allow for flexibility. Consequently, there is a high risk of misinterpretation of implementation obligations. Again, an example will help us understand the logic of rule ambiguity better. Article of a good governance code regarding the conflict of interest does not encourage the sport organization to enter into contracts of employment, independent services, supplies, or any other contracts of financial nature with members of the board, employees, and technical advisors of that organization, as well as with their wives, children, parents, and siblings, or with legal entities in which the aforementioned persons participate. However, the verb encourages can be interpreted in various ways, leading to inappropriate actions by the organization's employees. Put differently, as much as these people want to comply because they do not fully understand the rule or misunderstand it altogether, they refrain from complying so they don't make the situation even worse. So these are the 4 logics that explain non-compliance. So next time you are against something that requires your compliance for the benefit of your organization, ask yourselves, why don't I embrace this principle of good governance? Make sure you give an honest answer. Now that you have an idea of why non-compliance in standards of good governance is often the case in sport organizations, in one of the next sessions I will give you the ways that one can overcome these non-compliance logics.